So please remember to turn on your microphone, Marlon.
Okay. Where's my video? There. All right, I'm back. Can you go to this maybe 5th slide? You move forward, please, to slide number 8. Oh, Marine, come on. Yes. Okay. Oh, I think I was talking about the effects of. Can you go back, please? Another one. No. That's that would be slide number 7. And I think I was talking about the demise of community reflection processes. So Indigenous peoples move and work as a community, and the oral nature of their communication patterns make reflection and decision making a very communal thing. With a breakdown of intergenerational ties and the focus on individual achievements, success and decision making, community reflection processes like storytelling and gatherings of the community are not convened, resulting in fragmented views or half-baked understanding of situations. The latter disables the community's capacity to act on situations that confront them and disperses their energy to act together as a whole or as a community. Another manifestation would be the graduates or the educated youth leaving the community or abusing the ancestral domain. Another painful experience of Indigenous communities is the exodus of their schooled youth because of the imbibed view that working in urban communities. For those who stay in the community, their loss of respect for the land as a cultural space tends to make them view the land only as an economic resource, and thereby undertaking activities that are detrimental to the environment just to increase their income. Such examples have motivated others in the community to do the same. And continued marginalization of communities. With communities disabled from working as a vibrant whole, many Indigenous communities remain marginalized despite having educated members. Individual success and growth of schooled Indigenous peoples do not translate into community growth and empowerment. As one elder put it, Indigenous youth do not anymore have a sense of the spirit of the community, that which binds and moves them as one and is the wellspring of the culture that they have given birth to through the centuries, that has guided them as a people to live in dignity. Along with the continued marginalization of Indigenous communities is the dying of the spirit of the community and consequently the dying of their culture. Next slide. The Philippines is one of the first to pass a law on Indigenous peoples. The Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act of 1998, or the IPRA, provides enough stipulations on the rights of Indigenous peoples to an education that is appropriate and culturally sensitive, not to mention the constitutional provisions also on the rights of Indigenous cultural communities to their ancestral domains. The Enhanced Basic Education Curriculum Act of 2013, or the Philippine K-12 law, enhanced the provisions of IPRA and the Constitution, emphasizing that K-12 in indigenous peoples areas need to be contextualized and localized to suit the local culture. So the K-12 in indigenous peoples areas is therefore Indigenous Peoples Education, or IPED. The next slide. In coming up with the curriculum framework of the Indigenous Peoples Education Program in Ifugao, we have these following guiding principles. This is also at the national level, of course. First, it has to be participatory. The school and community stakeholders have something to contribute to the development of the IPED curriculum and shall participate in all of the processes from planning to implementation. The community shall participate in research and validation and even the instruction and evaluation. The school is encouraged to strengthen its partnership with the community, not only through the PTA, but more so its relationship with cultural groups. It's also inclusive. It includes different formal and informal learning modalities. And it has to include both indigenous peoples and non-indigenous learners. IPED is also empowering. Through IPED, Ifugaos or indigenous peoples regain their right to assert their own culture, their right to self-determination. The third principle is, I think this is also universal among indigenous communities. In the language of K-12, education should be culture-based. So culture among indigenous peoples is based in the ancestral domain. Therefore, the ancestral domain should not be understood merely as the geographic territory, meaning the land, the air, and water, but should also include their belief system, their values, custom law, and other community practices. The ancestral domain is a classroom in itself. IPED will not focus merely on the manifestations or products of culture like dances, songs, and material artifacts, but shall prioritize morals, principles, ethics, and philosophy. Next slide. Now, there have been several initiatives by mainly coming from the non-government sector. At least for the Save the Ifugao Terraces movement, we started working on indigenous people's education since 2006. So we had this project called Nurturing Indigenous Knowledge Experts Among the Younger Generations of Ifugaos. It's NIGHT for short. We partnered with the Federation of UNESCO Associations in Japan. So UNESCO Japan is also a private, it's a non-government organization. So during the NIGHT project, there was this massive mobilization of elders in the different Ifugao communities who worked hand in hand with the academe, particularly the Ifugao State University, and also with the Department of Education. So the elders they're like the indigenous knowledge professors. So teachers and members of the community had to go through a lot of trainings and seminars on how to integrate Ifugao indigenous knowledge into their teaching competencies. The NIGHT project lasted until 2012, but we were able to establish community learning centers, one of which is the Community Heritage Galleries also, the IPED now the IPED Center, the only community-led IPED Center in the province. And of course, we have the City Pills Project, or the Center for Taiwan Philippines Indigenous Knowledge, Local Knowledge, and Sustainable Studies. So these initiatives in IP education is actually a partnership. It's not just between the community or the academy, but it has become like an international collaboration. So we work with Japan, we work with Taiwan. Our local university, the Ifugao State University, is helping a lot in furthering the cause of indigenous people's education. Now, we have to understand that it's like a big shift for the formal education sector to go into indigenous people's education. Massive work has to be done, like coming up with textbooks, because the textbooks that we're using now are nationally standardized textbooks. Teachers would have to undergo a lot of training and come up with learning modules, instructional materials that would suit the ideals of indigenous people's education. Next slide. Now, this is this is particularly in working on the City Pulse project. We came up with an instructional iPad instructional framework for Ifugao. So the basic, the most important aspects of Ifugao culture have been included in the framework, and it's also used as a guide to curriculum development. So of course we have Ifugao history, the family and kinship system, traditional Ifugao society, and custom law. Now these topics are very important, since these things are not found in any of the textbooks being used in the schools, no? Because everything comes from the national government. So you don't have textbooks on Ifugao history. No mention of how the Ifugao family or the Ifugao kinship system functions, or any lessons on traditional Ifugao society or even custom law. Next slide. The Ifugao cultural landscape, particularly on land ownership and management, is also one of the highlights actually of Ifugao indigenous knowledge, and we gave importance to this particular topic because this is like the soul of Ifugao culture. This brought about our rice terraces, our social stratification system, how villages relate with each other and how families relate with each other. The rice fields, the forests, the village. This has been given emphasis in the modules created by the Department of Education and the Ifugao State University. And of course, it's also very it is a very important issue, especially now, the time of climate change. So perhaps the most important in terms of traditional knowledge or IKSPs is how the Ifugaos relate to the land. The rootedness of indigenous peoples is with the land. Indigenous identity is anchored on the land. If education becomes a tool to strengthen this identity instead of weakening it, then there's a brighter future for indigenous communities. That land is life and is sacred is fundamental to our worldview as indigenous peoples, and this permeates our indigenous knowledge systems, where the ancestral domain is a classroom and teacher at the same time. And nurturing and protecting the ancestral domain is a fundamental tenet in molding the young. Each indigenous community is different, but all indigenous communities struggle for the right to self-determination and to their ancestral domain. Pursuant to the stipulations of the 1987 Philippine Constitution, the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act undertakes to improve the situation of indigenous peoples. But laws such as IPRA have to be effectively implemented in light of the existence of other laws that violate the rights of indigenous peoples. The resolution of the problems of the indigenous communities or indigenous peoples relates to the elimination of the deep-seated discrimination against them, a task that remains difficult to achieve. education, or rather indigenous people's education, may very well provide a clear solution to these generational problems of cultural genocide, discrimination, and powerlessness of indigenous communities. I think I have to thank you for now, and I'll take questions from here.
Thank you, Marlon. Thank you for your sharing, and I think we can open the floor so that we can, have further dialogue. So, any comment or question? Maybe Professor Lin Lao Shi. Yes, please.
Yes, I just put some words on the comments that thanks for Marlon's talk. I feel there's a great similarity between what you have described about Philippines, about the education of traditional knowledge and Taiwan. Yeah, I feel it's so relevant that when you describe your experiences in Philippines, because by what I have observed in Taiwan, that also the traditional knowledge of indigenous people is so much disrupted by the state education system. My question is that yes, but I see that you have already a very comprehensive indigenous knowledge education in Ifugao. But how do you achieve that? I mean, do you get the funding from the state, or how do you because the state don't have the idea to facilitate that kind of traditional knowledge education system. But how do you achieve that? And how do you get literally the funding or all these things to support that kind of establishment of indigenous knowledge?
Yeah, we have funding from Taiwan. No, it's really ironic, because as I mentioned earlier, when we started in 2006, we actually had a very minimal funding from UNESCO Japan. Yes, there was no support yet on indigenous people's education in the Philippines, because the law on indigenous people's education only came about in 2013. Though the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act has provisions on the right of indigenous peoples to have their own educational system early as 1998, but there was no state funding for that. So again, as I mentioned earlier, it's actually the non-government organizations who first advocated, who pioneered the advocacy on the right to education and the right of indigenous communities to indigenous people's education. So, well, we're still at our birthing pains. I mean, the state, the Department of Education is still trying to grasp the entire concept of indigenous people's education. Even our teachers, even if they belong to indigenous communities, it's rather difficult for them to shift. It's like it's a paradigm shift for them to suddenly change everything into something that's localized, something that's contextualized. And they've been doing a lot for the past 3-4 years. They've been doing a lot of training, or should I say, retraining of for teachers, basically in the primary schools, for them to shift into something different. The Ifugaos who are teaching now, or people who are working in the academe, have been trained under the national education system. So for them to shift into some culture-based education or local-based education is also different. It's also difficult. So it would take longer than we want for them to really shift into indigenous people's education. I'm hopeful that the government is getting more and more conscious of the rights of the indigenous peoples to their own kind of education. And hopefully, if we have the best president this year, then I think we would have the national government to be more responsive to the needs of indigenous communities, particularly on indigenous people's education.
Thank you so much, Marlon. I would like to also echo Professor Lin that in Taiwan, there's a situation that the government, try to give the budget or money to invest into the building of so-called indigenous knowledge system. But as you say that if the teachers in the system in the regime now, they are trained in a very colonized mind, and they just receive the budget and the money from the government, and they are doing the same thing in name of indigenous knowledge education. That's something very dangerous that we are facing nowadays. And Professor Lin also reminded me that earlier. So I see Donna do have some questions, right? Please, Donna.
Marlon, thank you for such an informative presentation. I just learned so much. I'm really grateful to you for that education. This part of the world, in some ways, we haven't had a chance to talk further, but in some ways, Southeast Asia is quite new for me. I've been living here a year. We'll be here roughly about 1.5 years or 2 years altogether. And I lived in China for a number of years, but this area is quite different for me. And I am thinking of everything that you've shared today through my own training and 20 years of experience working in the Navajo Nation in the U.S. Southwest, where there's some really similar themes. I'm so struck by what you've said about the massive shift that's required. I've observed the same thing, and the need for culturally relevant histories and educations, and just the lack of materials. I'm really impressed with what you all have done with the curriculum design. So you're doing a kind of critical pedagogy because you're thinking about a decolonial education, a kind of critical pedagogy. At the same time, you have to invent the materials and you have to invent it. So it's incredibly creative, and it's just, I'm really impressed. And I guess I have, two questions that are kind of like comparative reflections with two key themes around Indigenous education that I've learned about in the Diné or Navajo Nation. I wonder if these resonate for you. One is that, and I mentioned this a little bit yesterday in my talk, that in 1968, the Navajo Nation established the first tribal college in the U.S. And it was founded kind of on a community college model as Navajo Community College, and then later changed its name to become Diné College. And since its inception has really centered this need for a decolonial, culturally relevant higher education, a college level education. And there's a Center for Diné Education. They do a lot of training of teachers that then go on to do the kind of culturally immersive decolonial sort of training you're talking about. I'll put the link in the chat just for anyone who's interested in exploring it further. But the reason I mentioned this example is because one thing that really strikes me about both the Philippines and Taiwan is the deep investment, though recent, of the federal government in these indigenous education systems. Whereas, like in the case of the Navajo Nation, this is really directed by the tribe itself, by the Navajo Nation as kind of a sovereign entity to sort of take control over education. Yes, they do receive some federal funding, but it's not, what they're doing is not in response to federal law, or it's not integrated at the federal level. So each federally recognized Native nation in the US, can then design and develop their own relevant curriculum for their particular histories and their particular citizens. And that's sort of part of this nation building process. So it's kind of an interesting counterpoint. So I guess I wonder, is there a space where a space of kind of self-determination or nation building for Ifugao or other indigenous peoples to both work with it. What's that relationship to the federal government like? You know, to work with that funding, to work with those state laws, like the 2013 law you mentioned, but also to advance some self-determination or some autonomy over that curriculum and over those educational institutions. That's kind of my first question. My second question just has to do with boarding schools, with residential boarding schools, which, you know, in Canada and the US have just been such a scar on people's experience. And there's a huge reckoning, as you're probably aware, going on right now with the remains of people that have been found at some of these boarding schools. So the kind of truth and reconciliation reckoning around boarding schools in North America is also part of how Indigenous education is being thought about today. So those were just two things that I offer as kind of points of comparison. I wonder if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, about the first question. Yes, the community cannot, by itself move towards Indigenous people's education without the help of funding from elsewhere. And of course, it's the national government who has the responsibility to do this, because it's also provided by the Philippine Constitution. Now, I think there are differences in how, although we share a lot of similarities with other indigenous peoples like the Navajo, but we do have differences in situations. Like even in the Philippines, land rights issues in the north, in Luzon, among the Cordilleras, and land rights in Muslim Mindanao, is there's big differences. So the approaches of the national government towards these issues would be different also. But in Ifugao or in the Cordilleras, when they started coming up with all these government programs on indigenizing the curriculum, this is also anchored on the constitutional provision on the granting of autonomy to regional autonomy to the Cordilleras and the other indigenous peoples areas in the south. Now, we since after the Marcos era, since after martial law, the Constitution provided that the Cordillera should be the state recognizes that there's a need for the Cordillera to have an autonomous region, given the differences. Their difference with the other parts of the country, and also Muslim Mindanao. So, this is the same thing with autonomy. Like, who grants the autonomy? It's the national government. So, if you're going to shift into Ifugao education, indigenous people's education, who gives the support? It's the national government. But would we be dictated upon by the national government as to how to educate our children? Somehow there are a lot of compromises that we need to also adjust to. We cannot go for a separate Ifugao Republic or a separate secessionist Cordillera region. We need to work within the framework also of the national government, and the reason why our autonomous region is. We're still in the process of approving an organic act because of the compromises that we need to make. We cannot get everything that we want. We know that we need to also work within the framework of national interest or the interest of the government. Although I think at least for the we have seen a lot of improvements in how the government addresses the participation of indigenous communities. Like way back in 2006, when we started working on the Nike project, we were just allowed to, we cannot tinker with the curriculum. We were not allowed to do that because we can only integrate bits and pieces of our Ifugao indigenous knowledge into the learning competencies of the formal schools. So And then a few years after that, in 2013, we had the K-12 law, which officially recognized that indigenous communities should have their own curriculum based on their culture, which is, as I see it, as in a very positive response to the demands of indigenous communities. It's a process. And I'm sure it's going to take a long time for us to really get that. And along the way, we need to enter into compromises, given that this country also has its own interest, and well, always in the guise of for the sake of the majority or for the dominant culture. But we do have I think a lot of indigenous communities in the Philippines are getting more and more assertive of their rights as cultural communities. There's this provision of the International Labor Organization, where the ILO 169, where the state should recognize the primacy of indigenous peoples on their ancestral domains. That has not been recognized by the Philippine government yet. So it's not a signatory to ILO 169, mainly because they do not want to officially recognize the ownership of indigenous peoples of their lands. Though there has been a lot of we also saw a lot of compromises on the part of government. We have special laws on say on land ownership or land management. Because the Philippines is still run by the Regalian doctrine. All lands belong to the state, and yet we have special laws, and the different departments, especially in the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, would have special circulars treating the rights of indigenous peoples, giving it's like a preferential treatment on indigenous peoples' areas, particularly in managing our forests. Now, forests are government properties; these are public properties, and yet in Ifugao, these are parts of our private domains. So how do you compromise that? How does the government would the government arrest us for converting forest into vegetable gardens or converting them into rice terraces? We have yet to see that. But because of course the government is also aware of how the Ifugaos are taking care of the forests, even without government intervention. So even if the national law says that all lands belong to the states, including the forests of the Ifugaos, but they do not apply the law harshly as they would if they were to implement the full force of the law. So I think the process of empowering indigenous peoples should also be in the context of working with government, avoiding conflicts. We've been in a conflict too long. Like most indigenous peoples' areas have been conflict areas since the time of the establishment of a national government during the time of the Americans. And we've been, I think indigenous peoples have bled enough, have fought enough, and I think they're tired. It's time to move on. And I think they've learned, both parties, including the government, they have learned that they need to work together in a more, walk the path of peace and, diplomacy.
Thank you, Marlon. I think this is very, again, very inspiring talk, and also very fruitful conversation. Because of the limitation of the time, I have to, close this panel and move to the next one. But we still have some questions from our audience. Like Professor Lin mentioned that Stephen's overview remind him the history of colonization, Spanish colonization in northern Taiwan. And also Alex Abler mentioned this in the chat box, that how to break down the boundary of East Asia and Southeast Asia, like between Taiwan and Philippines. So how do we trace back to the history and have rediscourse the relation between Philippines and its neighbor, Taiwan. Okay, so I think that's also very interesting and important question, but I'm sorry that we are not able to discuss it now, but maybe later we have, later in this afternoon, we have a general discussion section. We can continue the conversation. So I would like to once again thanks to Marlon and Stephen, Professor Lin, Donna, and everyone in this wonderful panel and conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.